Hi there! Thanks for tearing yourself away from the Queen's Gambit or simply staring at the wall, and for joining me for this episode of the Unlocking Landscapes podcast. I'm your voluntary host, Daniel Greenwood. Thanks so much to all the listeners to the pod so far. I really appreciate the feedback and support you've given. We've got some really interesting people lined up this year, and I'm really looking forward to sharing their stories with you. In England, we're still under lockdown, so these are indoor pods recorded over Zoom. And just a disclaimer, any wildlife or landscape sound effects are purely accidental. This month, I'm talking to Raki Nikahetiya, a photographer who lives in New Delhi, India. Raki splits his art into documentary photography and interdisciplinary exploration. He ventures into the worlds of anthropology, botany and cosmology, using the camera to capture new findings. I met Raki in London several years ago through conservation volunteering, when we bonded over having similar camera systems. It's not the case anymore though, because his camera is way too heavy for me and I've gone for something much lighter. I find Raki's photos and other work really inspiring. I really enjoy watching his Instagram stories showing life in New Delhi, but also the tropical landscapes and wildlife of India, something you really don't get in England. Make sure to check out his website and social links, which are listed in the description. In this episode, we talk about life in New Delhi, where violent protests are taking place and people are adapting to life under COVID. Raki talks about the amazing wildlife he experienced as a child in Sri Lanka before fleeing civil war and living in Vienna. Raki also shares his stories about the indigenous communities he's worked with in places like Mozambique and trips to the remote Andaman Islands in recent months. We talk about how growing up with vipers in the garden, and encountering elephants have inspired his passion for wildlife and the landscapes of the world. Thanks again for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Hi Raki.
Hi Daniel.
Thank you very much for joining me on the Unlocking Landscapes podcast. How are you doing today?
Thanks for having me. I'm great, thank you.
Great stuff. Where are you right now in the world?
I'm in New Delhi in India at the moment.
And what is life like in New Delhi?
So it's been warming up slowly. It has been a cold winter in New Delhi. I went for a really nice stroll in my happy place in New Delhi, which is the Sunday Nursery. It's an old or newly done Mughal garden, and I've been photographing there. So it was been a good morning, especially that the smog is lifting slowly, and it has been particularly a smoggy winter this season. So I've been enjoying springs, or appreciating springs even more so.
Yeah, I follow you on Instagram, as you know, and I watch your Instagram stories whenever you update them, because they're sort of the sort of thing I like to look at in my lunch break or an afternoon or morning break, because it completely takes you away from England. So it's really interesting to see that. But I remember a video you had of the smog, and I thought it was mist. It was so heavy. So what's that like?
It's very heavy, as you say. It's very unhealthy as well, that you all know. And at some points, it can be so thick that you barely see 2 meters or 3 meters. And I think there's a maximum level of what the WHO authorizes on a normal basis on this microparticles. And sometimes it's so bad, it's sometimes, I don't know, tenfold, 10 times higher than the maximum recommended air quality. So it can be quite intense. But I think that particular video was, I was on the way to the mountainous areas in Uttarakhand, which is north of Delhi. And it was so bad that the whole tour up to the mountainous hills, and there was a 6-hour car drive, was completely covered in smog. So obviously we couldn't open the windows, but the moment you stepped out, it really smelled quite bad. And it has this very specific petrol smell to it. And
is it petrol that's causing the smog?
The short answer is yes, it's partly that, but the bigger part is so-called stubble burning, which the farmers in the Punjab area perhaps you heard also of the farmers' protests recently happening in India. It's this stubble burnings, which are one of the main causes. Basically, this huge smoke clouds are going into Delhi, and because of the cold weather, they linger on over the city. So it's quite bad, especially in the colder months.
And so that stubble burning, I presume that's to increase fertility or to free up the soil for replanting again?
Exactly. So it's basically to free up the soil. And it has been forbidden in many countries. I mean, also in any European country, it's forbidden since a while. I don't know how long, but it's been forbidden. But here it's sort of the easiest and most cost-effective way to do it. There are 2 cycles in terms of agriculture and farming in India, and this happens only twice a year, but it is the worst during the cold months. So especially in Delhi, I think that's the majority of where the pollution comes, not only the traffic, but the majority is the stubble burning. But there's another thing which is quite bizarre and unique. It's the street sweeping requirements within the city. So basically in a lot of countries or cities where this is not an issue, street sweeping is being carried out normally during nights. And in Delhi, it's in the mornings. So the pollution is the highest in the mornings, where we have at our flat here in Delhi various air purification systems, but also like a monitor before you go out. You have to always wear a big face mask, so you look like a Batman baddie normally. So it's really crucial that you wear it. And you sometimes see it, and it's normally, when it's really bad, it's hazardous, and it looks really like after like a nuclear fallout or something.
Goodness me, that sounds quite scary. It almost sounds like London in the 1800s or early 1900s.
Exactly, yeah.
Are there plans to improve air quality realistically?
I think yes. The government is trying, I think, hard to push different plans through and basically help this issue, because lots of people obviously are not so lucky and don't have like air purification systems, and it's particularly bad if you're a child and have like not fully developed lungs. So it's particularly bad for many people, and it's not only in the capital but many other cities in India as well. So there's plans, but another issue is as well, of course, there's no alternatives for example, farmers instead of the stubble burning. So there needs to be also, I think, like more sort of solutions for alternatives where the people can either prevent stubble burning or have other sources of heating instead of, for example, using wood during the cold periods. But it's a very complicated and very politically full discussion here in India, but also in many other countries, I think.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the farmers' protests, and that has come through in the UK news, and obviously Europe as well, because Greta Thunberg got involved. Sorry?
And Rihanna,
yeah. Are you seeing evidence of that unrest around where you live at all, or in your day-to-day life?
On a daily basis, normally, because a lot of our travel around the city is basically linked to that. So especially the point I said, I was going with another photographer, who's a good friend of mine, to Uttarakhand, and during that period we had to take so many different routes which are not basically outlined on Google Maps to get to Uttarakhand because of the roadblocks due to the farmers' protests. So the farmers were coming from the direction of Uttarakhand, Punjab, into the capital to protest for like various reasons, which I'm sure you've been following and reading as well. And you can see it. I mean, there's been clashes as well, and a recent one has been where I wanted to go to my studio space, which is on the other side of town, and there has been, I think, one farmer lost his life where they tried to take over the flag at the Red Fort, which is sort of like a very important site in Delhi. So they basically managed to like break through and take over the Red Fort in Delhi. So there has been several cases, I think, clashes between police and farmers.
Yeah, it sounds really serious, much like the sort of unrest we were seeing last year after the murder of George Floyd. And there's obviously in Belarus, there's social unrest because of the election there. And then there's what's going on in Russia at the moment. So there's a lot of people taking to the streets at the moment, aren't there?
Mm.
I just wanted to.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you as well. I mean, I met you in London in the woods. I think it always sounds really strange when I say that, through conservation volunteering. And I was wondering if you could just give an outline of how you came to be living in New Delhi.
So basically, I think I boomeranged my life in that way. I was originally from Sri Lanka. I was born in Sri Lanka and ended up in a place close to Sri Lanka. So when I was around 5 years old, I moved to Austria, Vienna, in the capital of Austria is Vienna. Moved to Austria and basically grew up there, and that was mainly under circumstances of the civil unrest and the civil war in Sri Lanka, which was happening there, and there was from 83 till for 30 years from then on, basically. But basically from there, I came to live in Vienna. I grew up there and met my wife there in Vienna. We were both working there, and then she had the opportunity to come to London, and we ended up near the Horniman in Forest Hill, near the woodland, and there we met. And then again, my wife had, with her job, and my mind was more flexible, to move to Delhi with her work. She was working for the Foreign Service, for the UK Foreign Service, on health issues. And since then, we've been in Delhi, and that's since 2 years now.
How do you find it compares living in New Delhi compared with a place like London?
Both cities have their amazing sites and their challenges. Both are very hectic and busy, I would say. Funnily enough, I found it easier to adjust to New Delhi life. It has been sort of more welcoming in a way, although London, it's still a home for me, and I really love London, especially being in that southern part of London, which was really great. 6 years we lived there, but I think there's really a lot of differences, but also like a lot of capital cities and a lot of bigger cities share that sense of busyness in a way, and everybody's busy and hectic. But the nice thing about Delhi is, I think, compared to London, you can just call your friends up and just say, "Oh, let's go for a pint tomorrow," whereas in London you have to take out your file of facts and basically arrange a meeting within the next 2 years. Which
you're still using a file of facts.
always.
Yeah, everyone in London is super busy, super busy all the time.
Exactly. Always on the move. Well, probably not now, but yeah, normally. Yeah.
How has COVID affected your life in New Delhi?
In the beginning, it was a complete lockdown, and I think lots of countries didn't know how to react to it. I mean, still there's discussions around how to react to it, but there was a complete lockdown from one day to the next. Basically, people were not allowed to move out, causing also a lot of stress especially for day laborers in cities like Delhi, in India, to be able to have sufficient food, or they had to move back to their villages, which was also not ideal, carrying also COVID back to these rural areas. So there was a sort of sense of like very quick, not really thought through action, I guess, to an unknown enemy, I guess. And then it evolved that the next few months were basically being spent at home, working, learning to make cheese and wine mainly, and which has been a very good life lesson.
That sounds pretty good, Raki.
It in the beginning it unfortunately didn't taste pretty good, but afterwards it evolved and it got better. And then from there on, it basically to where we are now in Delhi. It's basically, if people would not be wearing masks, I wouldn't have the feeling that I would be in a global pandemic. And I mean, one would say, okay, this is like really horrible and shocking. But there's sort of social distancing, and being India, there's lots of closeness, I think, because it's physically impossible also for a lot of communities in like certain neighborhoods to keep that distance because of space. But people are wearing masks, and the mortality rate is very low. And I saw some figures yesterday that the overall case load is similar to that of last year in June, where it was still, compared to the number of people, it's still not that high. Yeah. Well, it is high, but like comparatively, it went down again. Yeah.
Yeah, in England, it's pretty terrible, to be honest. But yeah, very very different situation, it would appear. So moving on to talking about your work, you describe yourself as an interdisciplinary photographer. And you just told me before as well that if you search for it on Google, you're the number 3.
Exactly. Not that many people look for it, but yeah.
No, I had that with, there's a place in Holland called Oostvaardersplassen.
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah.
You know about that? Yeah.
No.
It's quite famous because of this rewilding project there. But I went there in 2017 with a group of sort of conservation professionals for a trip there, and I wrote an article about it and I put it on my website, and it has a huge amount of traffic, and I think it's because I managed to get into the tag. The tag is so unusual that if you search for it, and also because it's in English, it comes up on the first page. So that was quite an interesting point you made there about getting into the search engines. Did you do that on purpose, or did you?
Yes, normally it would be that I would probably say no. It was absolutely not on purpose. But like this one was on purpose. That I got some tips from like some people who are serious and they know about this kind of stuff. So I got some advice from them how to do this things, how to outsmart the algorithms. So I mean, I don't think we outsmart them, but use them for your own benefits.
Because you had a great quote about why it's important to focus on a small area.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So basically, the reason also for focusing on one area of expertise is obviously like my interest. But another thing was, which I think we talked about earlier, is there was some really interesting talks on TED, and one of a speaker who was basically inventing things which have no purpose and have no use. She did this like amazing TED talk. She said the single most important fact to be an expert in your field, or the best in your field, to have a very small field. So I thought that's actually a very good advice. I shall take that.
I think it's definitely true of the internet age as well. I noticed on social media, the stuff that gets most traction is quite unusual things. I mean, personally for me, the stuff I get, I mean, I'm not out there looking for loads of likes and stuff like that, and obviously not getting it, but ancient tree photos are like wildfire on Twitter. There's something about
really?
There's something about trees on Twitter. People really are into that, but also fungi, which is such a broad area anyway. But it's becoming more fashionable.
Well, as you know, I'm a big fan of fungi. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember you sent me some nice pictures through some of the stuff. Everywhere you seem to go, you seem to have fungi coming out everywhere, like in Austria and also in the tropical rainforests in India. But yeah, just so for everyone who's listening, I mean, we're going to be talking about Raki's work, what motivates and inspires Raki to do the work he does, but also the places that you visited there as well, and the equipment you're using, and some of the communities that you've been involved with there. But I think, Raki, one of the best thing I can ask you to get into that is, how did you get into the current area of work?
So what I'm doing now is mainly photography, documentary photography, and contemporary art. Neither of which I've studied. So basically, my career, when I started off, was in journalism, and there I already had a very keen interest in photography. But I wanted to do a bit more, and I was quite interested in like the area of development aid and being able to meet different people, understand different issues, and contribute to, I guess, a greater good. And yeah, you can hear I was like just straight out of uni, so I did economics, and you want to change the world and all these things. But I started then interning, and I was really lucky to work with the United Nations, and that was in Vienna. I worked for the UN body, which is focusing on industries, called UNIDO, and it's based in one of the headquarters in Vienna. And I was basically during that time in Vienna. And then for the majority of my career, then I switched when I moved to London. I was working for the British Standards Institution, and there also was working on projects from China to Mongolia, and also some projects in Africa. Also very much looking at policy level work to like help countries to, for example, improve their food safety standards or standards in general. But I was always quite interested since a young age, when I was growing up in Sri Lanka, into wildlife, and basically learning more about wildlife, but also doing something. I just didn't know what, and I was just like very lucky that I was just living across Sydenham Hill Wood, which had sort of volunteer workshops and volunteer days. And that's, I think, where Daniel and I also met in London, in the woods, as Daniel said. And I got more and more interested into it. And I then thought it would be great to work there. And one day I was working in Mongolia, and it was a very cold winter. And in one of the pubs, I was meeting a person who was working for the London Zoo, for Zoological Society, and he basically said it would be a great idea to have more people at the zoo, at London Zoo, who also have a connection with international business, I guess, and with like trade, and having this linkage between wildlife and the global economy in a way. So that's when I first really thought about London Zoo. And 2 years on, there was actually an opening for London Zoo, and I thought, okay, this must be like destiny. I might apply for that, and applied for it. So I was like working within a team for marine conservation, where we looked at certain things related to marine habitats, but also linking people's livelihoods into sort of the global supply chain, which, for example, like using recycled carpets to put them back into the supply chain, which also help the communities, but also would prevent things like ghost fishing, which is basically like floating nets, which like kill fish or the habitats where they are, and it's a massive contributor to plastic pollution. So basically looking at sustainable options. So I really enjoyed that. But as said, I was still interested in photography, and also more and more into art. And ultimately I was very interested in the works and the roles I was doing, but I was quite passionate about the photography. And for me, I think it was sort of a way of bringing a change, or trying to show people a different way of basically how art could contribute for things like environmental issues or communities and issues related with migration, which will be potentially a bigger and bigger problem in the future. So my way of contributing to that, starting from coming out of uni, trying to or wanting to change the world into like coming into art and basically using art as a way to like contribute to society in a certain way.
You said how you started out in journalism, but the thing I really picked out was you said that you were talking about your memories of wildlife as a child in Sri Lanka. And it almost sounded like you rekindled that interest through an urban woodland in South London. And I think that's something that seems to happen quite often with people who enter into sort of environmental volunteering. I'm sure it's the same for loads of other things, but particularly with exposure to nature, in terms of, you know, as a child, that there's a period in your life between the age of maybe, I don't know, 12 and 25 for a lot of people, or even older, where they just don't have an interest in that anymore. Those sort of early memories of wildlife in Sri Lanka, like what was that like?
I grew up in a place near to Colombo, which is sort of a agricultural based region. It was very, very nice when I was a kid, basically. So it was my granddad's family and both my parental sides, they were mainly looking at like agriculture and farming in that kind of context. So we basically grew up on a massive chicken farm. So that has obviously nothing to do with wildlife. But when I was a kid growing up there, it was basically running through the paddy fields, and I had so many cousins there which were in the same age. So for us, exploring the little streams, being in the jungle on a daily basis, after school or during the school holidays, and mind you, it was only until I was 5, and then only in the summer holidays when I came back with my parents. As a typical, migrant holiday would be the places you come from, or you have family or relatives as a very economical way of staying somewhere. But it was fascinating for me. There was like a very important memory, basically being out and about, having a great time in the great outdoors, if you wish, and sort of having this very childish feeling of exploring and looking for little things, and trying to understand on how everything works. So it was a beautiful thing, and I think that being in London, I was always looking for that. I was never a big city person. I say that, probably have like a Stockholm syndrome because I'm constantly living in big cities. But I have definitely like a keen interest in this kind of wildlife scenario. And the change from Vienna to Sri Lanka was very, very radical in that kind of context. Although I really love the nature in Austria as well. Absolutely stunning. But in Sri Lanka, there were so many animals which were also potentially deadly, and that doesn't really go well with childhood curiosity, I think. So we were exploring a lot and not really having any boundaries to we had 2 king cobras in our garden, and there were constantly little vipers and different snakes. So there's always like this danger where you like have a respect for nature, where there are certain boundaries you need to like respect, which is sort of a good thing in a way, I guess. But I had like different memories. Also a recent one, I think. One was when I was very little, and my granddad used to have water buffaloes. And one day, and it was a herd of, I think, like 30 animals. One day, it was like this Jurassic Park moment where we were sitting outside and the tea began to make little circles inside, and it looked really, that moment in Jurassic Park where the T-Rex is coming out. There was this massive herd just running through the whole grounds, basically demolishing everything. They had just like a scare for 1 second, and because of that, they were running towards us, and we managed to escape. But it was definitely like a memory. And I had a similar memory 1.5 years back, where I was. And that was when I started doing my photography, and I was basically working on a series on the last indigenous people in Sri Lanka, where my cousin, a ranger, and I were in a national park, and that was one of the national parks which was newly opened. And it was also one of the areas where the war was happening, when the war was still taking place in Sri Lanka, the civil war. And the elephants there were particularly not very accustomed to visitors. And these guys would have like 3 to 4 visitors or tourists coming into the park. And it was quite a big park. And the elephants were quite wild, and they made us feel that it's their territory. And I remember particularly one place where we were driving through, and we were in this like little Jeep, and that could have been easily destroyed. Seeing this massive water fountain rising up, and we thought it's just some sort of weird gas leak explosion or something. But it was this like huge bull who saw us and probably smelt us like miles away, standing there and basically not moving and playing around with water and really showing its presence. And we were just completely scared. And we were just like, the ranger said, like, drive close and we can like see what's happening. And we said, like, we're definitely not going to drive close. We're just going to stay and do nothing. Whereas my cousin was basically, it was our car, but because he was driving, because I didn't have the Sri Lankan driver license, he was putting the window up, and the ranger and I looked at him and said, like, well, that's not going to make a difference, mate, if he's attacking us. But we managed to get out of it, and it was again this feeling of you are actually very little compared to nature.
Yeah, and that's something that is quite difficult to come by in the UK. In a place like the south of England, the best you're going to get for that is, in many ways, it's some of the trees that you'd find actually growing in London. So some of those big London plane trees, and out in other parts of the south, there will be the old oak trees and big beech trees and stuff like that, and maybe some of the big trees you get in some of the formal gardens.
Another one memory was basically that's less violent actually, was stealing my grandmother's. So my grandmother used to wear a sari, and it was always on the for drying at some point. And my cousins used to always take it, and we loved to see what's in the little pond. So there were a lot of little crayfish, crabs, tiny little fish. So we used to put it in, and the sari was so thin that it was like a little net. Obviously, it's not a good thing to do nowadays, but we were just curious, and we released all of it back again. But that amazing diversity is not there anymore, quite interestingly. It's slowly coming back into the place my parents are living, because my dad is very, very engaged with biodiversity, but normally you don't see that.
What do you think has driven that decline in biodiversity?
Pollution, bad agricultural practices. There's also less sort of wildlife corridors. I think it's also a big problem in the UK in general. But I think it's mainly pollution and bad agricultural practices. So people would perhaps use, let's say, too much fertilizer or put oil to get rid of weeds, and basically only look at the cash crops, or like the crops which basically produce a yield, but not keep the weeds and the wildlife on the side. Whereas back in the day, there used to be more, let's say, permaculture, forest type agriculture, which was basically a way of keeping the richness of the plants, but also the animals which are living there on balance.
And so when you left Sri Lanka and you went to Austria, that must have been interesting, because I think probably the biggest threat in the wild in Austria is probably a tick bite, isn't it? I mean, I think there's wolves in Austria, but you're unlikely to encounter them, surely.
And bears now as well, but slowly they're coming back. I think over Slovenia, and the wolves over Poland, I think. Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, there's not so many wolves and bears, but I think they're slowly coming back. Yes, ticks are numero uno danger point. So I think it was like a typical thing in Austria to be vaccinated against ticks, which is part of the school curricula there.
And did you spend time in the Austrian outdoors? Did you go to the mountains with your family? And I presume you must have gone on school trips, surely. That there must be a culture of Austrian school trips to the mountains and stuff like that.
Yeah, Austria is a very outdoorsy country, which has been really great. And I think being in Austria and growing up in Austria also brought me very close to like nature and enjoying especially walks in nature. Hiking and walking and also skiing, as you of course know, is such a big part of Austrian culture. And it really brought out my interest as well in like exploring and being out there, and especially being in the mountains. For me was a really amazing experience ever since I was a child. So mountains are sort of my happy place in that kind of way, thanks to Austria.
And you've managed to travel to places like Mongolia, haven't you? And I had a question for you about something you mentioned earlier about photography, and I think it was in reference to when you worked for London Zoo. It's funny when you say you work for London Zoo, because people just have an image of you know, feeding fish to polar bears and stuff like that. I'm not sure if they've got polar bears there, but because you do something which I think a lot of people don't realise is quite common, particularly in the charity sector, and particularly with environmental charities, is people with skills that are not required of their role. So, for example, you're a photographer, you've got photography skills and journalism skills. You use those within your, particularly it sounds like you did with your work for London Zoo, let's call them ZSL. So using photography, I mean, that's something I've done as well. And it's something I really enjoy about using those skills in work, because I mean, I don't think I could ever make it as a professional photographer, but I was just wondering if you had anything to say about using your photography when working in formal roles.
Yeah, quite often. I mean, I used it throughout my sort of career, and I think the moment it started was working for a magazine in Vienna, and basically I was interviewing during that period and writing basically down the interview, like interviewing the person in Vienna. And I think at that point the cameraman couldn't come, the photographer couldn't come. And I said, "Oh, I have a camera. I could take some photographs as well." And thankfully, they trusted me enough to do that. And since then, I actually started enjoying taking more photographs more than actually writing. So that's how it started. And then throughout my career, I've been using the camera on various occasions. Might it be with the role I had working in Vienna, or with ZSL, which has been practical as well. And it's probably also easier to tell the story in a more authentic way, or tell it through your own angle, because you're probably more closer to the actual story or the role.
So, because you worked in Mozambique with fishing communities, didn't you?
Yeah, so one of the projects with ZSL was where we basically helped coastal communities to ensure that they're more resilient in the current context, but also to like climate change, that they have other ways of income apart from only fishing, that also contributing to like less depleting of sort of livestock. But in general, it was just fascinating, because one very vivid memory was, and since then I've never seen anything like it. So basically, there's something called cleaning, where fishermen communities go out into the beach areas and basically look for anything which is edible. And you have to keep in mind, Mozambique is a sort of a LDC country, a least developed country. Lots of people are living under $1 a day, so nutrition is a huge issue, especially for these like very communities which are in the north part of Mozambique. It's called the Cabo Delgado region. It's a beautiful area, but all these people are going out in this like almost desert-like area when the ebbs out, basically, and are looking for anything which is edible from different worms to fish. There's a lot of sort of questionable practices, which you would say now is questionable, but it's basically these people are trying to survive. So it's basically mosquito net fishing, which is a huge issue in lots of countries. So it was a very vivid memory of this like very bright white sort of coral and sand beach, which was just visible because the water was out, and then hundreds and hundreds of people going out to look for food. And that was on a daily basis. So that was something which was also scary, but also like, you know, that was basically their livelihood there.
And so you were photographing these communities whilst working with them?
Yeah, so basically, I mean, of course, you need to be careful as well when you photograph, especially with people that you get their consent as well. But it was mainly portraying or documenting their life, and that without saying what is bad, or you know, sometimes you have always this narrative, oh, this is not good, or they're extremely poor, and all those sort of things. But everything is very, very nuanced and very balanced. So everything is more complex than just black and white, or poor and not poor. So it's basically trying to get that angle of like personal stories and conveying a message, which it's up to the person who views it to like decide on their own and try to basically get an interest. I mean, that's the whole thing about a photograph, no? Like getting an interest and creating a story.
And I suppose trust is very important as well.
Yeah. So a lot of communities I work with, there is normally a period of where you build the trust. I mean, photography is always like in that role, there was a byproduct. So not only photography, but if you want to work with different communities, you need to build that trust, but you need to also have like sort of focal points within that community who you can talk with, who you can engage with. You need to work with sort of elders to get their buy-in and understand different structures within the communities. I mean, of course, it depends on the different workloads, but it's also, I think, a very interesting way of, because normally I've seen it in a lot of my work, but also in like a lot of other colleagues' work, where there's an assumption that with progress, or you're coming from a developing country, you come into these not developed countries within brackets and want to show a better way of life. But in a lot of cases, these people already have like a very ancient way of living the lives, and these lives are made more difficult because of a different other influences they can't control. So if they would be left on their own devices, they could sustain a life, but because they've been cut out of certain things, or because might it be pollution or whatever, or fishing, industrial fishing, for example, in that context, they are on the brink of like basically really facing hardships. But it was interesting also to like take a step back and learn from them versus just going there and saying, okay, this is a training manual, this is how things should be done, versus trying to also understand what their way of living is.
You touched on it a little bit there, but what are the things that are driving people into that kind of poverty? Is there this problem with overfishing that's reducing stocks of fish that would have been there to sustain those communities before? Or you also mentioned pollution as well. I mean, what is driving people into that poverty?
So just to clarify, before I mentioned, basically it's like lugworms, which are in the beach. So not the typical earthworm. But yeah, there were different species which you not normally see in a fish market if you go to like also in these villages. So basically they were looking for nutrition in that kind of context. But coming back to your question, it's I think, yeah, definitely pollution and in industrial scale fishing or overfishing is certainly an issue. But also population size is definitely an issue. So I think working and also basically working with, especially with women in those scenarios is very crucial. And also looking at issues in a wider context. and looking for options which are, or basically scenarios which are not really focusing on one particular issue, but try to understand the different facets of like this particular society. So, for example, if there are fishing communities also showing other agricultural practices where they can, for example, grow legumes and vegetables to contribute to their nutrition, or create sort of protected areas where fish stocks can be recovered, which means that people will have ultimately more fish versus just a continuous overfishing. And during that periods when they can't fish, that they will have other sources of not only income but also nutrition. So it's basically going back to the roots of where we actually come from, like basically leaving periods of rest for environment to recover and then going back to harvest.
Yeah, and that seems to be a problem the world over, particularly with agricultural intensification in Europe, and problems with soil being degraded. So it's interesting how that kind of human impact is spread out across the world at the moment, and likely driving biodiversity declines as well. So I did say earlier how I'd been watching your Instagram stories of your videos traveling around India. Where have you been visiting recently?
So recently I've been to the Andaman Islands, which are an island group off the coast of India. It's in the Bay of Bengal.
And I would presume those places are pretty rich in species and biodiverse.
It was an incredible place. So the Andaman Islands have sort of very interesting biodiversity, as you can imagine, because it's islands. There's sort of endemic species. But I was very interested in the sort of the woodland landscapes, because there's this amazing trees and beach forest areas, which are mainly made out of sort of bullet wood trees, 30 meters tall trees, which are growing directly at the beach. So normally this was the first time that I ever seen such a thing. It felt like prehistoric. It felt really prehistoric. So it was this massive woodland just at the shore, where we would normally expect it to be further inland. And during these excursions as well, it has a very interesting forest life with a lot of endemic birds, lots of lizards, very friendly lizards, which were not afraid of any human closeness in a way. And then on the other hand, you had the amazing underwater life. I'm not a diver, but I'm a keen snorkeler, and we went out with some seasoned divers, and basically went around, snorkeled out for 30 minutes, 40 minutes outside into open waters, where you could basically see a massive coral reef, and it was just full of pufferfish. You could see octopus, you see really huge lobsters. It's just incredible. And then I often ask myself, if it looks like this now, how did it look like 100 years ago? Probably 3 times as much. And then you see all this like paradise, and the only situation where you really are reminded, hang on a minute, we're in the 21st century, was when you basically start snorkeling just 10 minutes outside, further along the coastline, and you see this basically cemetery of dead corals, just all white corals because of coral bleaching. And that's really puts you back into perspective. Hold on a minute, everything is really connected. And that was where you can see there's this amazing biodiversity, this amazing richness, but then also there's this like connection to us as a species in a way, I guess, and the 21st century, which was quite eye-opening in such a close vicinity in a habitat. Perhaps you've heard of the Andaman Islands because of more negative news. I think 2 years ago, a missionary was attempting to convert people I think, into Christianity in the North Sentinel Islands, and he was welcomed with bows and arrows and lost his life there. So I didn't go into those areas. Those areas are basically complete. So Andaman Islands is one of the last places on Earth where the population and communities which are completely untouched by the 21st century, by the modern world, basically. So it should stay that way. The islands we went to were basically completely habited and linked to the 21st century per se. You travel from India and come to a place called Port Blair, which is the main island of the Andamans, which is the capital of the Andamans, if you wish. And from there, whichever island you want to go to, and there are various, there's also volcanic activity in one of those islands. You can take a boat, and with that boat, you basically travel through the Bay of Bengal and arrive on whatever island you like to. We were here on Havelock Island, which has been fascinating. Yeah, and as you said, there's quite a lot of biodiversity there.
You also went on a photography trip, didn't you, with a friend of yours? What sort of pictures were you taking there? What did you see? Where did you go to?
So there I went to Uttarakhand. It was with a good friend called Francis Taylor. You can follow him on Instagram as well. He's a wildlife photographer, and he's also currently based in New Delhi. And we went out to. He was photographing mainly birds, and I was focusing on mountain ranges and landscapes for my contemporary artwork. Yeah.
And talking about your photography, what equipment do you use particularly when you went onto that trip? What did you take with you?
For that trip, I took my 50mm camera, the wide angle lens, then my normal go-to lens, which is 24 to 70. Nikon lens. So I'm using a Nikon camera. It's a Nikon D810. And I'm not very much normally into like camera equipment and camera gear, but why I'm using it is basically for some of my work, I need to have like really big, very detailed photographs. And so and there's counter arguments to that, but like I used it basically to have more and more clearer pixels in my photography. But normally when I travel, I use 2 to 3 lenses maximum, and I also use an analog camera.
So for those of you who don't know about a Nikon D810, it weighs as much as a car. It's pretty heavy piece of equipment, but it's very good camera, isn't it?
It's very versatile, yeah. And
also your 24 to 70mm Nikon lens is a famously brilliant lens, but also famously very heavy. So you must have some pretty good upper body strength right now. Strong knees. I have a very good chiropractor. Yeah. You mentioned as well that you have a 35mm film camera. I'm really interested to know what is motivating you to take that sort of photography, because obviously it's so different to digital, and digital has completely just destroyed the film market. But there is still, it's still alive, the 35mm film market and other millimeters as well. But why do you bring both different formats with you?
I think 35mm at the moment is very trendy. Lots of people are using it to go back to the good old days in a way, I guess. But then there's also still film used from very high-end photographers, which are still using it for gallery quality level photography. Why I use it is, so I have the Nikon FG20, which was one of the go-to cameras which journalists used in the late 80s. And I use a 35mm lens. very simple, normally black and white photography. And I use it because of slowness, really. For me, photography is turned into such a thing which is very quick. You can do it on your phone. You can do it with your digital camera. You press one button and like it just shoots faster than you can think. And it's basically unwinding the process. And for me, it was very helpful to go back to basics and have this very manual, very slow process where you have to really think about the composition. It's something which you don't do very quickly. Although, of course, back in the day, you used to. It was a camera which you use for reportage or documentary, and it has to be quick. But I use it for the opposite. I try to be slow with it. You have 36 shot, and you need to be thinking on how you want to develop it and what you want to take of, or why do you want to take a photograph. So that's that thinking, and the image happens in your mind, and then afterwards the camera is just there to like basically realize it. And of course, with 36 shots, is also like nowadays developing gets more complicated and so on. So it's basically, it helps me to like turn the process back and be more thoughtful when I take a photograph.
It sounds like you're trying to make the most of both worlds, because you've got the high-end digital SLR with the big pixel coverage, so you can make nice big images, but you also improve yourself in a more kind of long-term way through using film. Because I used to use film cameras when I was sort of in my late teens. I think a lot of people don't know that they really miss waiting that period of maybe 2 weeks or something of when after you've taken the pictures for them to actually arrive. Because I used to order them by post, and that's how it used to happen. Are you processing the images yourself in a dark room?
I'm not developing my own film at the moment, but now I'm hoping. I normally get the film roll processed, so I can basically have the negatives and potentially could go into the darkroom and do my own photographs. So I basically have quite a pile of photographs which need to be fully developed. So at the moment in Delhi, there's a place where I'm hoping to go in the next month or so to do that.
And at the moment, we talked a lot about where you've travelled to and places you've lived in. What projects at the moment are you working on?
So I'm still working on some documentary projects. One when I can travel back to Sri Lanka, hopefully, which is with the last indigenous tribes in Sri Lanka called the Vaniyaleetto. Try to work with them and the University of Colombo on that in terms of how to preserve culture, which is basically passed on through oral history with photography and with audio recordings as well. And then another project which I'm working with on, it's more contemporary project, which is to do with petri dishes and cave paintings. It's basically a project on the human microbiome. So I'm working with a professor from the Uni of Barcelona and a lab. So it's basically a bit of a quirkier project, but I shall reveal a bit more on my Instagram page on that in the coming weeks and months. Petri
dishes and cave paintings. That's an interesting mixture. I'm reading a book about Neanderthals at the moment. So when you said,
I love those.
When you said anything about cave, a light went off in my head. I've got two more questions to ask you before we finish. The penultimate question I have is what advice that you would give to people who are interested in your area of work or doing something similar in photography or something, as you described it, interdisciplinary photography?
I would copy something which I got as a very quick advice during a book signing once. At the White Cube in London, there was a book signing once with Tracy Emin, And I went to their book signing, and I basically overcome my anxiety of like not asking this question, but I just went to her, and like while she was signing the book, I asked her what makes a great artist, which for that period and still for me is like a wider question. And she said 3 things, and that just like came out of the blue. And she said like, learn to draw, work extremely hard, and there are no shortcuts. So work extremely hard and there are no shortcuts. I think that's these 2 givens which work for anything, but for whatever one's interest or field is, I think learn that field and try to get a keen interest in that field. And another thing is, I think it's never giving up. I think the most successful people are the ones which basically, no matter how people say it's not a great idea or you can't realize it, people who are stubborn with their idea and just like keep it going. Those are the most successful people, I think, in a way, who are able to fail.
So keep ploughing that small field.
Thank you, Ashal.
As you said earlier. So the last question I had for you, Raki, is if you had lots of funding to invest in environmental or social projects, what would you support and why?
Probably 2 things, actually. One, environment and trees, because I just love trees. And another one would be children and education. So I think there's a really good organization called 1T, or called the 1 Trillion Trees Movement. Basically, there's an argument always if planting trees is the solution for everything. Of course, it's just one part of the bigger picture, but I think basically tackling issues which are slowing down the global warming is definitely planting trees is definitely one way of getting there. And the other one is, which is quite key, I think, our next generation. I think like thanks to people like, I don't know, I was listening to a podcast today of Malala, which was like quite interesting, but like human rights and the role of women in society and the importance, but also people like Greta Thunberg. I think there's this generation said, which is like doing amazing stuff. And I hope all the issues which our generation or the generations before us couldn't tackle, that the next generations will be able to overcome and solve. So I think education is a key, and there are so many different charities around the world. But I think one of the most important thing is starting within your communities to like help that. Whatever you can do, I mean, like even planting trees in your garden and also working with your communities. I think that's where one can start.
Thanks, Raki. Yeah, I really do agree about education. It's such an important thing. I think people do underestimate how important education is. And of course, there is this, in the UK in particular, there's this sort of renaissance of children spending time outside. There's the awareness of nature deficit disorder and the impact that not having a connection with the outdoors and nature, the harm that can cause later on in life. So, yeah, I agree. I think that's really important.
And I think coming back to your point as well, I think from the beginning of when we started talking about what are things which reminded us or like stayed in our memory, and it was for me this fields in Sri Lanka, the woodlands, and that sort of resonates, I think, and that sticks with you even when you're grown up and you want to sort of recreate that like wondrous world of how it was. And that's probably the reason why we are doing what we're doing in that kind of context.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's a lovely way to end the podcast today, Raki. So thank you so much for your time. You've taken us to some places I've never been to before. And I think that people hopefully listening to this, especially in a wintry pandemic time, I think people will really appreciate listening to your stories and memories of all these places that people can't get to at the moment. I mean, I wasn't about to step on a plane to Mozambique. I'm not sure if you can even do a direct flight there, but it's been really nice talking to you, Raki, and hearing your perspective about your work and your life experience.
Thanks so much for having me. It was really great fun.
Cool. Have a great day and take care.
Thanks, Daniel.
Ciao.
Ciao.